Well, if there's one thing the 5070 does win in, it's that the Founders Edition packaging is a lot smaller. So more efficient packaging, that's the 5070 Founders Edition up against the 4070 Super Founders Edition. Maybe I can get the light to hit that just right so you can see it. Anyway, so those are the GPU models we're comparing in this video because I wanted to make sure we're Founders Edition against Founders Edition here, because even the tiniest factory overclock might hide any of the differences that we see here, because it's not wrong when I'm saying that the 4070 Super is sometimes faster than the 5070. The 4070 Super came out 1 year ago and was widely available at its MSRP of $599 and was occasionally discounted by 20 or 30 bucks. The 5070 comes in at an MSRP of $549, but currently is much higher priced on the actual market. Hopefully things settle down. Now in Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p RT Overdrive, neither GPU does great. It's 43 FPS versus 41, and the previous generation 4070 Super has the 5% advantage. If we move up to 1440p with RT Overdrive, I had to go down to DLSS Balanced mode in order to get anywhere near 60 FPS, and the 4070 Super hits 59, while the 5070 hits 58 at these settings in the built-in benchmark in Cyberpunk. That gives a 2% advantage to the 4070 Super, so again, these are functionally the same. Now, I will say at least that with the new DLSS Transformer model, Balanced mode at 1440p is now actually, I would say, usable, whereas previously I would have tried to steer away from that aggressive upscaling at 1440p, so at least we do have that. Now, if we go ahead and kick on frame generation, we see the biggest new feature for the 50 series. Frame generation can go to ×4 mode instead of ×2 mode. So if we look at that here, we see that the 4070 Super in its max frame gen mode, which is ×2, it can hit 103 FPS output, although the input responsiveness will feel more like half of that, so around 50 FPS. The 5070 can be matched at like-for-like settings in ×2 frame gen mode, and it's outputting 100 frames per second, but again, its input responsiveness will feel like about half of that. So technically, again, the 4070 Super ahead, but by a meaningless, really, amount. It's basically a tie. Now, you can go into ×4 frame gen mode instead of ×2 frame gen mode on the 5070, pushing it up to 177 frames output to the display, but only 1 out of every 4 is a traditionally rendered frame that's responsive to user input. So if you look at the latency figures up here, you can see that the latency numbers are highest, even though you're getting a larger frames per second. Could be playable here at these settings, but again, just something to keep in mind. Now, if we move on to 4K RT Overdrive with DLSS, we've got to go to performance mode just to get anything remotely playable, and we're still not doing great. The 4070 Super's at 39 FPS versus 38 on the 5070. So there's really, I just don't think these are 4K path tracing GPUs is really how I would read that result. Now, you could go ahead and kick on frame generation, and this is where I think it's important to highlight what frame generation isn't. It isn't a way to go from being in the 30 FPS range to having a great experience. Because we can see that with 4 times frame gen enabled, the 5070 is outputting almost 120 frames to the display. But they don't look amazing. It's going to be hard to see in this slow camera pan footage. I have a separate DLSS 4 video, though, where you can see that coming from a base frame rate in the 30s, there's a lot of visible artifacting, and the latency isn't great. You can see here that the latency is often over 70 milliseconds. Now, I'm not saying that using frame gen doesn't improve the experience compared to the low base frame rate, but I'm saying that if you think 120 FPS in this situation means this is an amazing experience, that is just simply not the case. Now, let's go ahead and move on to testing out reduced settings. Since those path tracing results, maybe the 1440p result was passable if you use DLSS Balanced. But what if we wanted to be a little closer to native res? Well, we could go down to RT Ultra instead of RT Overdrive, and now at 1080p, we're getting 72 FPS versus 73, and the 5070 is out to a commanding 1 FPS lead, rounding out to about a 1% advantage. But at least it's a win. Technically. Technically a win is the best kind of a win. At 1440p RT Ultra, well, they're tied. It's 45 FPS for both. And again, both are a little bit weak for native 1440p RT Ultra. You could play at this frame rate, but I think it would make sense to use DLSS. Now, again, the upscaling using DLSS quality with the new transformer model I think looks quite good, and now frame rates are also quite good. The 4070 Super hitting 78 FPS versus 76 on the 5070, putting the 4070 Super 2 frames per second or 3% ahead. But again, it's essentially a tie. But again, kind of sad to see a regression where the 4070 Super is more performant. Now, again, you could kick on frame gen and all that, but I've already kind of explained the overall thoughts on that. I think frame gen's a good feature, but it's going to make this video 3 hours long if we enable all the various frame gen settings on every single test we run here. Anyway, at 4K, if you're using RT Ultra and go to the DLSS Performance upscaling, you do actually get close to 60 FPS here. It's a 58 average. Do keep in mind that averaging 58 means the 1% lows are actually down in the 40s, meaning you're certainly dipping below 60 FPS in many demanding areas of the game. So keep that in mind, but it's certainly at least playable now. And of course, you could reduce settings from here or not even use ray tracing or all sorts of things, but I think that's enough Cyberpunk. Let's move on to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. If we start out at Supreme settings, which is not the full path tracing mode, it's just the maximum non-path tracing mode, but the game does always use some amount of RT. We see that both GPUs are good for over 120 FPS. The 5070 is 2% faster at 124 versus 121. If we move on to 1440p Supreme settings, both GPUs are still doing great, 92 FPS versus 97 on the 5070, giving a 5% lead. I think that's the biggest lead we've seen so far for the 5070. But if we move on to 4K Supreme, even using DLSS quality doesn't save the results. The 4070 Super runs out of VRAM and just runs slow, and the 5070 just has weird glitching artifacts with the DLSS. So they're just dead. Anyway, let's move on to Spider-Man Miles Morales. I chose this as a game that's a lighter weight game where the ray tracing is still transformative. I would say that having RT reflections enabled in this game makes the game look massive improvement compared to having RT off. So I think it's a good ray tracing test. Here we're seeing both GPUs doing really well at maximum settings plus RT reflections. I'm not turning on RT shadows because I don't think those actually add much to the game and further reduce performance. So this is more of a optimized RT settings, I guess we could call it. Anyway, the 4070 Super's at 125 versus the 5070 at 128, 2% lead for the 5070, yay. 1440p, very high plus RT reflections. Both GPUs are still doing great with no need to upscale. 4070 Super at 88 FPS versus 91 on the 5070, 3% advantage for the newer card. A little bit bigger in the 1% lows though. And if we go to 4K very high plus RT reflections, now you'd probably end up wanting to kick on upscaling, because now the 4070 Super is at 45 FPS versus 49 on the 5070. It's a 9% lead for the 5070, so the biggest lead we've seen so far for the newer card, but not at settings that we're likely to use. If we go ahead and kick on DLSS Performance, we can get over 100 FPS again, though. 103 on the 4070 Super, 109 on the 5070. Of course, you could use less aggressive DLSS settings realistically, but I just use Performance here. The 5070 is taking a 6% lead at these settings. At 1080p, without ray tracing turned on, but otherwise maxed out, we can see that the frame rates are significantly higher without ray tracing on. It's just we were able to get good frame rates with ray tracing, and I think it made a big enough visual impact that it was worth it. That being said, if you turn ray tracing off, I thought it was interesting that the 4070 Super is now faster in this game. At 229 versus 217, 6% lead, but again, both of them will feel right at home on a 240 Hz display, like it's fine. At 1440p very high, it's 167 versus 162, still with the 4070 Super out in the lead by 3%, so again, it's functionally a tie. Both will feel right at home on like a 165 Hz 1440p display. 4K very high settings, you don't even need upscaling. You get an 88 FPS on the 4070 Super and 89 on the 5070. Hey, at 4K, the 5070 did manage to claw back a lead, albeit by 1 frame per second. In Silent Hill 2, which is an Unreal Engine 5 game that does feature hardware lumen, so hardware RT, Max settings at 1080p, we see 72 FPS on the 4070 Super versus 73 on the 5070. That's a 1% advantage for the 5070. Look at that. 1440p Epic RT, we're seeing 49 versus 50, so 2% lead for the 5070, 1 frame per second. And again, you might want to kick on some upscaling. So if you do, and you're at DLSS quality, you can now get over 70 FPS on both GPUs, 73 on the 4070 Super and 75 on the 5070. 3% lead for the newer card. It's functionally tied, and my kids just got home from school earlier than usual, so you're probably going to hear some talking in the background. Anyway, Silent Hill 2 4K Epic RT with DLSS Performance mode upscaling is what you need in order to hit around 60 FPS. We're getting 62 versus 63, so it's a 1 frame per second lead, 2% lead for the 5070. Again, functionally a tie. If we turn off ray tracing, Silent Hill 2 1080p Epic settings, but it's the software lumen, not the hardware accelerated lumen. Frame rates do increase. The 4070 Super's at 85 versus the 5070 at 89. 5% lead now for the 5070, one of the bigger ones. At 1440p Epic, the lead grows to 7% at 61 versus 57. So one of the bigger leads we've seen so far for the 5070, not that it's particularly noticeable. And DLSS quality now pushes frame rates to 86 and 93, putting the 5070 8% faster in this test. At 4K Epic settings, you still need DLSS performance to be at, smooth frame rates, well over 60 FPS. It's 71 FPS versus 76. The 5070 is leading by 7%. Let's switch over to a competitive title. If we look at Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and I'm testing out basic settings here because I think in competitive games that makes sense. Because you both increase frame rate for competitive edge and responsiveness, but also decrease visual clutter. It's easier to spot enemies. In certain games, sometimes like foliage will disappear, so enemies can't hide in it. Sometimes easier to spot in shadows, flatter textures. All sorts of reasons why I think low settings make sense for competitive titles. We can see here that both GPUs are good for high refresh rate, 1080p, low settings, competitive gameplay. 256 versus 244, and it does put the older card 5% ahead of the newer one. At 1440p basic settings, it's 188 versus 176, 7% lead for the 4070 Super. So again, both doing well, but again, kind of interesting that we're seeing an advantage for the older card again. If we go to DLSS quality at 1440p basic, we're getting really higher frame rates now. This would feel right at home on a 240 hertz 1440p display targeting esports gaming. 4070 Super right at 240 average, 228 for the 5070. It's a 5% lead for the older card. At 4K basic settings, both break 100 FPS. It's 105 versus 102, but that is a 3% advantage for the older GPU. But really, if you're playing at 4K low settings, you're probably going to upscale as well. So if we do that, DLSS Performance pushes the 4K basic results up to 185 and 181 respectively, 2% advantage for the 4070 Super. So again, it seems like the older card is favored in CoD Black Ops 6. Let's move on to Final Fantasy 16, where at 1080p Ultra, both GPUs do well, and pretty much equally well, averaging 85, although there's a small difference in the 1% lows. At 1440p Ultra, at 60 versus 61, so the 5070 takes a commanding 1 FPS lead. At 1440p Ultra with DLSS quality, we can push to 83 and 86. The 5070 expands its lead to 4%. At 4K Ultra settings, neither GPU is doing great. We're talking 34 versus 35, but is 1 FPS better on the 5070. Realistically, you're going to use DLSS. At DLSS Performance mode, the 4070 Super hits 68 FPS versus 74 on the 5070. It's a 9% advantage for the 5070, which is one of the largest leads we've seen so far, but it's still not pushing the double-digit percentages. In God of War Ragnarok at 1080p Ultra, both GPUs do great, 104 versus 105. The 5070 has a 1 FPS and 1% advantage. 1440p Ultra, it's 83 versus 88, so at the higher resolution, the 5070 seems to be expanding its lead to 6%. And at 4K Ultra, it expands its lead to 8%, which is 56 versus 52. This is very playable, especially on a VRR display. However, I think it would make sense to take advantage of DLSS at a 4K output to still look great and get a much higher frame rate. So with DLSS quality, the 4070 Super pushes to 76 FPS versus 80 on the 5070, and it's a 5% lead for the newer card. In Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, which is another Unreal Engine 5 game, high is the highest settings available in this game. At 1080p, both GPUs do well at 83 and 80, which in this slow-paced of a game is great. That's a 3 FPS and 4% advantage for the 4070 Super, so this is another one where the older card actually takes the lead. In 1440p high settings, the 4070 Super is 60 FPS versus 57 on the 5070. 5% lead for the older card. They're both around 60 FPS, so you probably don't need DLSS in this slow-paced of a game, but if you do kick on DLSS quality, you get 89 FPS versus 84. 6% lead for the older card, and it's a very smooth experience, especially for this slow-paced of a game. At 4K high settings, we're seeing 34 FPS versus 33, 3% lead for the older card, 1 FPS, and again, probably not the frame rates you're looking for. So what if you kick on DLSS quality? Well, now we're close to 60 FPS at 58 versus 56. It's a 4% advantage for the 4070 Super. If we move on to Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high, which is the maximum settings available in the game, we're seeing 117 FPS versus 121, 3% advantage for the newer card this time. And at 1440p very high, things are still cruising right along at 89 FPS. This time it's a tie. And at 4K very high settings, it's 51 versus 52. That's a 1 FPS and 2% advantage for the 5070. If you kick on DLSS quality, you smooth out the frame rates quite a bit, and it's 72 FPS for the older card, 75 for the newer. It's a 3 FPS and 4% advantage for the 5070. In Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p very high settings, both are doing great, 122 versus 120. That's a 2 FPS and 2% lead for the 4070 Super. 1440p very high, we once again see the 4070 Super taking a 2% lead, so this seems to be another one of the games that slightly favors the older generation at 89 versus 87. And at 4K very high, they're tied at 49 FPS, although a bit of a lead in the 1% lows for the 4070 Super, but realistically you'd probably be chasing a higher frame rate by using DLSS. So let's kick on DLSS quality. Jumps to 80 and 81 respectively. Hey look, the 5070 took a 1% lead. And that's the tests that I ran on these two GPUs. So let's pop out for a little bit of final analysis. One thing we can look at is this graph. So this summarizes not the frames per second, but the percentage advantage for each card in every test that I ran. I've assigned the positive direction to be advantage for the newer card, the 5070, and I've assigned the negative direction to be the advantage for the older card when it had advantage. Both calculations are done as the faster one divided by the slower one in that particular test, so that the percentages are compared fairly, and then I've just arbitrarily decided one GPU to be assigned a negative value so we can split it like this. You can see that really game by game, it just varies which GPU has the advantage. Although if you look at the scale on this graph, the biggest lead for the 5070 is 9%, and the vast majority are a lot less than that. And the biggest lead for the 4070 Super is 7%, and again, the majority are a lot less than that. And we even have a lot of zeros showing up here, where there's literally no difference in the average frame rate. The geomean of this result is the 5070 is on average 1% faster than the 4070 Super. So that is, I would say, very disappointing as a generational uplift. The only thing salvaging this, well, there's two things kind of salvaging this just to make it this could have been an email, why did they even make a newer card? One thing is that we do get the multi-frame generation, right? So let's talk a little bit more about my thoughts on multi-frame generation. And I really want to focus in on, once again, the idea that it's not raw performance, but it is a good feature. So having ×4 frame generation, here it's enabling you to hit almost 120 FPS from a baseline FPS of around 30. And I don't think this is good. This is why I say it's not a replacement for raw performance. It might be a better experience than not using the frame generation, but realistically, it's still going to have a lot of artifacting and a lot of latency when you're coming from that low of a base frame rate. Generated frames are not a substitute for raw performance when you're running out of performance, when you're not at a good baseline. Whereas when we had a higher baseline frame rate, like we did at 1440p DLSS Balanced, then I think it's more useful for just filling out the motion fluidity of a high refresh rate display. when you're at a higher base frame rate, there's less difference between the two rendered frames that it's using to generate frames between. So the accuracy of the generated frames tend to be better. And also, a higher base frame rate means you have lower latency to begin with. Frame generation can add a tiny bit of latency. It doesn't necessarily add a lot, but it certainly doesn't improve your responsiveness. So you need a reasonable responsiveness that you're happy with before turning it on. And then it just fills out the motion fluidity. Whereas actually increasing frame rates traditionally would both increase the responsiveness and the motion fluidity. You would get two benefits rather than one. Anyway, so I would say that having the ×4 frame gen mode is nice in situations where you have a really high refresh rate display, like a 240 hertz display or higher, because then you can fill that out coming from a baseline of around 60 FPS, and it'll mostly look and feel pretty good. And in many games, though not all, you'd probably prefer the motion fluidity to not having it. But it's by no means doubling the actual performance compared to the ×2 frame gen mode that's available on the 4070 Super. And like I said, it doesn't really help you in situations where you're just out of performance in general. Anyway, so there's that. And then the only other thing is that technically, at least on paper, the 5070 is supposed to cost a little bit less. Let's pretend for a moment that MSRPs actually exist and mean anything, and then we'll talk about real-world pricing at the time of filming. So technically, the 5070 is meant to be a $550 card, and the 4070 Super launched at $600, meaning that the price ratio is 0.92-ish, or in other words, we're about an 8% less money. Now, the performance increase was only 1%. Now, if we divide the performance ratio increase by the price ratio, we get the performance per dollar ratio. You could kind of think about it this way, performance per dollar. So if MSRPs were true, then the 5070 would be offering a 10% improvement over last year's model in terms of performance per dollar. How many frames do you get per dollar spent? That's how you could think about that, because it's essentially the same performance for a little bit less money, $50 off. However, how we've seen it at least so far since launch, it's only been a couple of weeks, is that supply hasn't been great, especially on MSRP products. Now, if I search for 5070s that are actually in stock right now, I can find one as low as $700. As far as 4070 Supers go, well, they've been affected by the bad availability of the new generation because they stopped production on the 40 series to make production for the 50 series. So unfortunately, the 4070 Super, even used, is selling for around the same price right now. So in the current market, these offer about the same performance at about the same price, except the 5070 is new versus used and does give you the multi-frame gen. So I mean, in the current market, yeah, I'd buy the 5070 over the 4070 Super, but in general, the 5070 at current pricing and even the 4070 Super at current pricing is just much worse than what we had during the 40 series. So we're getting much worse actual price to performance compared to what we could get a year ago. So another way of looking at this would be, thinking about the actual price versus what we could get a year ago. So if I'm like, I can buy one in stock right now for $700, I could get that performance a year ago for $600. That means I'm now paying 17% more money for the same performance that I could get a year ago, plus an extra generated frame or two. Anyway, that's my overall thoughts. So if you're watching this video, first of all, to think if you should upgrade from a 4070 Super to a 5070, it's a side grade plus a little bit more frame generation. That's it. It's not worth the hassle. However, if you're watching this video to decide, like, you're watching supply drops and you're watching the used market and maybe a good deal pops up on a used 4070 Super, but there's also been some supply drops near MSRP on the 5070, you're deciding which one should I buy? I would say that obviously if they're the same price, the 5070 is better in the sense that it has the same performance and a little bit more of a frame generation feature. But I wouldn't pay a lot more for either one. So I would say, honestly, if you can wait for the market to hopefully settle down, that's my advice. If you can't wait, then just really between these two cards, they're incredibly similar. Just get the one that's the better deal. I would pay a few % more, I guess, for the 5070 to get the multi-frame gen feature because, like I said, it is nice to have if you have a high refresh rate display because you can take advantage of that for some additional motion fluidity on games where you already have a high base frame rate. That's my overall thoughts. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, found it useful and or interesting. I'm doing tons of big detailed side-by-sides and big graphs and whatnot for all of the latest GPU launches, compared with each other, compared against previous generations, all of that. So stay tuned to the channel if you're interested. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.